and welcome to the final lecture for Philosophy 110 Online. This is Unit 5, all of it, where we're looking at some final thoughts and the nature of the examined life. To do that, we're reading two selections by Plato, The Allegory of the Cave, and a piece called Socratic Wisdom. So, what we're going to do is sort of do an overview of the Allegory of the Cave, an overview of the piece called Socratic Wisdom, and then we're going to look at some big picture thoughts on what philosophy is and how this class is, and basically what the role of philosophy is. That's the biggest thing I want to touch on. So specifically what I'd like to do is I kind of want to get out of any particular issue or any particular debates, and instead look at the practice of philosophy as a whole. It's sort of an extension of the sort of things we talked about at the start of the class. But since now you have a little bit of a better idea of what philosophy is, how it works, you've actually done a fair bit of it yourself through your journals and your exams, that I think it kind of worthwhile to look at this sort of thing now as opposed to at the beginning of class. This is the better time for you to be able to understand and appreciate the kinds of things we're talking about. So, in order to do this, we're going to look at two famous readings from the founding period of Western philosophy, from ancient Greece, the time period where Plato was writing. Specifically, while Plato's the writer of both of these, we're going to be looking at a piece that is specifically Plato's, as well as something that's actually, really Socrates' instead of Plato's. You see, if you remember Plato, he was the author of the Republic that we read in Unit 2. But, you see, Plato's works, in general, can be divided in a couple of different camps. Some of Plato's later work, like the Republic, is distinctly his own. There are things that Plato came up with totally himself. But some of his early writings are actually just considered to be records or retellings of the kind of thoughts and arguments that Socrates had. And by Socrates, I don't just mean the character, I mean the real historical Socrates that was Plato's teacher. Somebody we've got a massive amount of historical evidence actually lived, but never actually wrote anything himself. And he didn't dictate to Plato. Plato just simply wrote things after Socrates' death. Now, the Allegory of the Cave is Plato's. It actually comes from the middle sections of a Republic that we didn't read. But our other reading, the selection of which is titled Socratic Wisdom, is something that actually happened to Socrates and is actually some of his own thoughts. But first we're going to look at the allegory. So, like I said, the reading comes from Plato's Republic. It's the part of the middle sections that we didn't read. The majority of the book where Socrates is making the big argument for his position, that reason should be in charge of your life because it's bad for your soul, for your mind, otherwise. Well, this is one of the things he uses to help prove a point along the way. So the Allegory of the Cave is just that. It's an allegory. It's a story with strong symbolism that's meant to illustrate the path of the philosopher and the role of philosophy, the role that reason has in helping you to accomplish certain things. So it's meant to show just what philosophy and the use of reason to question and examine things, what it does for people. And in the Republic, it backs up the idea that reason should be the thing guiding the soul by essentially showing why certain things are the case. Why it is that reason can tap into reason can tap into truth that simply desires and emotions and drives can't. So the allegory goes something like this. Imagine, if you would, a cave. And inside of this cave, there are prisoners who are bound and chained to the wall. And they're bound and chained in such a way that those prisoners, for one, they live their entire lives in the cave. They weren't brought into it at some point. They're born here, they die here, they live their entire lives chained to the wall of the cave. And their only entertainment, the only thing that they can see or that they can interact with, is the wall. And on the wall of the cave, there are shadows being projected onto it. You see, near the back of the cave, there's a fire burning. And in between the fire and the wall, there's a walkway, along which people, not prisoners, but the people who put them there, are able to use puppets and other objects to cast shadows against the wall of the cave. And so, since they have lived their entire lives here, since they were born and will die here, and all they have is to interact with each other in the wall, these shadows are the only things that the prisoners inside the cave know. It's the only thing they have knowledge of, it's the only thing they have experience of. The shadows are their entire lives. Now suppose you took one of these people and, by chance, he found that he could free himself from his chains. And so this man discovers he can leave the cave. He works his way out, and he gets outside the cave. And what do you suppose would happen? Well, having lived his entire life inside of a cave, his eyes aren't adjusted to the outside world. The sun is far too bright, everything's too intense, he doesn't recognize any of it. So for a while he's simply blinded. He can't see or understand anything that he looks at. But in time, his eyes slowly adjust. First, he'll be able to see and interact with things in shadows, things that are most like the cave environment he spent his whole life in. In time, he might come to understand, say, reflections and shadows and that sort of thing, the images of things on the surface. But eventually, he'll be able to actually see directly the actual objects out there in the cave. And he will be amazed. His entire life has been in such dim lighting and interacting with shadows that color, texture, size, three-dimensional shapes, all of these things are brand new and wondrous to him. They are things that he had no words for, no comprehension of prior to leaving the cave. He's, for the first time in his life, seen real objects instead of the shadows of objects. He can see real horses instead of the shadows of a horse, a real bird instead of the shadow of a bird, and trees and people and everything else. For the first time, he is seeing what reality is actually like. Now suppose that this person then, wants to share his wondrous things. It's only natural. And he tries to go back into the cave and share all the wonderful things that he's discovered with his friends and family back inside the cave, with his fellow prisoners. But they're not going to understand that kind of thing. Think about it. If you've been trapped in a cave your entire life, and one guy who managed to get out comes back and starts talking about this green thing. He's making this high-pitched noise, green, with his mouth. He's trying to describe how it's like a shadow, but it's not like a shadow. It's got this weird kind of thing to it. Oh, and it's round. It's got, it's like a shadow, but if the wall wrapped around itself or something. This guy is trying to explain things, and he sounds like a crazy person. They have no experience, no reference point for any of the things he's trying to tell them. And so, they don't believe him. They don't listen to a word he says. The man realizes that the only way they're going to understand the things that he has come to discover and find out and what he's experienced is for them to experience it for themselves. And so one by one, because he cannot manage any larger amount, one by one he frees the prisoners from the cave and leads them out. And so shows them, for their own eyes to see, all the things that he's discovered. And so he shows them trees and horses and plants and birds and the sun and color and wind and all these other things that he's discovered. And so only by leading them out of the cave can they understand the things that he's seen. Now, this being an allegory, this is more than just an interesting little fable. You see, Plato meant this to be, a set of symbolism, or a instance of symbolism where each individual thing matches up with something real. You see, the way Plato intended this, the shadows on the wall of the cave represent what most people know and think about. The only things they have experience of. The only things that they concern themselves with. In Plato's wider thought, these are mere reflections and representations of real things. It's the popular vision of what a good life is, as opposed to the reality of what a good life for a person is, and so on and so forth. And the outside of the cave is the realm of truth. Now, in Plato's metaphysics, this realm of truth, the way things actually are, is also meant to be like the realm of forms, which are the perfect, eternal concepts of things that make them what they are, like the pure essence of a square, or of a tree, or of virtue, or beauty. But that's all stuff you don't need to worry about. That's way above your pay grade and outside the realm of the class. The point is that, according to Plato, outside the cave, people see real things, not their shadows. So they see the world as it actually is, not just how it seems without thinking or the way that they've always seen it before. outside of the cave is what the world actually is. It's the truth of things, not just their appearances or a shadowy reflection or distortion of them. And for Plato, philosophy is the thing that is the journey out of the cave. Only philosophy, only the use of reason to investigate and to question things is what allows people to move from the mere representations of things to the reality of things, moving from appearance and seeming to actual truth. And one of Plato's main points in offering this allegory in the Republic is to illustrate that only philosophy and only reason can get you out of the cave. Everything else you'd be a prisoner to. Like a prisoner to your desires, to a prisoner to tradition, to what other people tell you. So the allegory is meant to illustrate the worth and the value and the role of philosophy in helping you to discover the truth of things. It's not just that it helps you find things you didn't see before. It's that it's actually leading you out of a shadowy reflection of the way things actually are. It's leading you from lie and deception and appearance to truth, at least in its ideal form, according to one of the most famous philosophers who ever lived. The guy's going to have a little bit of a philosophy bias. We got to admit this sort of thing. But he's not the only one who thinks this way. You see, Plato was the student of Socrates, who, as I said, was a real, living human being in addition to being a literary character. Socrates was Plato's teacher and lived in Athens, just like Plato, for some time about 450 to 500 years before the usual turning point. I would say the birth of Christ, but technically we use Common Era stuff now, and plus the birth of Christ is debated, historically dubious, and somewhat well supported. So anyway, just big mess. About 450, 455 BCE, Plato and Socrates were alive. Socrates was a real citizen of Athens, a real philosopher, who, for most of his life, was pretty much near homeless and a wandering teacher. He basically wandered around the marketplace, engaging in conversation with random people, teaching people who followed him around, his friends and students, and really didn't work at a regular type job at all, period. He didn't even do the regular version of teaching. At that time, there were professional rhetoricians, people who taught you how to speak, how to do basic math, how to sound convincing, called the Sophists. Socrates hated these guys. They charged money, exorbitant amounts of money to teach children and wealthy patrons how to sound convincing, no matter whether the argument was good or not. He just taught them how to do things like most politicians do. Politicians even still hire people much like these folks. But Socrates didn't care for any of that. He never charged people for his teaching. He wandered around and basically just did a lot of conversing and chatting for fun about philosophical topics. And over time, he ended up pestering enough people that they actually really got sick of him. And so, over time, the elders of Athens decided that they were going to charge Socrates with a crime to get him to finally just shut up, to stop messing with the kids, stop getting them to contradict their parents, because Socrates is essentially the first philosopher as we understand it, the usual sense of philosopher. There were some folks who were pre-Socratic, but they largely did versions of science and that sort of things. Natural philosophy, trying to investigate how the physical world is made up. So, Socrates did a lot of what we consider philosophy today. He's really the father of moral philosophy in particular. He questioned everyone he could about virtue, about what the good life is, about what duty and obligation and courage and all these other things are, and he taught everyone to question everything. And so the children, teenagers that would follow him around, well, they got to be where they wanted to be like Socrates. They asked questions of their parents, of their elders, of the priests at the temple. They asked questions and refused to take things on faith or obedience. They didn't listen to other folks. And this really drives people in power and the keepers of tradition absolutely mad. Drives them crazy. So, they decided to get together, charge Socrates with a crime, and get him to shut up and leave the kids alone. So, they charged him with corrupting the youth, and being impious, that he taught people not to revere the ancient Greek gods. And so Socrates was brought to trial, he was convicted, and sentenced to death by hemlock, a poison he was forced to drink. So this famous painting, called The Death of Socrates, is actually a representation of him being executed. There's Socrates there lying on the bed, being given the cup with his friends and students, weeping and listening to his lessons up to his very last dying breath, which supposedly is actually how it happened. Dude never stopped doing philosophy. Now, our reading is an account of that trial. It is a retelling of what happened at Socrates' trial, and it's called the Apology by Plato. Now, it's a dialogue, a lot like the Republic, so it's meant to be a dramatic thing where people are arguing back and forth, so they're different speakers. It's not just one person writing an essay. But most of it is Socrates addressing the citizens of Athens. I don't know how many of you have taken a world history course. You'll have to at some point. But Athens is one of the first democracies. It is a direct democracy, meaning that the citizens who are all above a certain age and own land, they're the ones who hold power in the group. So whenever there's a trial, whenever a law has to be passed, they all get together and they vote on what it is that's going to happen. So Socrates, after being charged with a crime, is allowed to defend himself and explain why it is that he does what he does. To try and justify himself to the people of Athens. And in the end, it doesn't work. But because he's explaining himself and saying, this is why I do the things that I do, it's referred to as the apology. It doesn't mean an apology in the sense of saying sorry. Socrates never, in that sense, apologized for what he did. He didn't think he was doing anything wrong. But an older use of the word apology that's much rarer nowadays simply means to explain oneself. And so in that sense is where the title of the piece comes from. And there's a lot of different things that we could analyze the apology for. Like, over the course of Socrates' defense and speech, he covers a lot of different topics. He addresses things like the meaning of life, what sort of attitude we should have towards death, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, the role of philosophy in the public sphere, the nature of duty and obligation, whether God exists. You can look at this for a lot of different subjects. But we're going to focus on it for just one of these, the role of philosophy. So, I'm not going to go in as much detail on the apology as I have with some of the other readings. At this point, we're wrapping up the class. You really don't need to know every aspect of what the guy says. But I want to focus on something. At one part of his defense, Socrates starts explaining literally why it is that he does things. What's his justification for doing all this stuff? Why did he ever start doing philosophy? And, like I mentioned, Socrates is really well known for doing this stuff. He's really well known for asking questions of random people on philosophical topics. He asked almost everyone he met about the nature of virtue, or justice, or courage, or how best to live. There's this one dialogue that Plato wrote that's a Socratic dialogue, they're called. And Socrates is on his way to the trial where he will be condemned to die. He meets a random guy on the road that he's seen a couple of times before. He knows his name, and that's about it. And they start chatting, they ask what's going on, and they get into a debate about what piety is, about what it is to be faithful to the gods. That's the kind of guy that Socrates is. He's on his way to a trial, to his trial, and yet he's chatting about piety on the way over there. And trying to figure out what piety actually is. But the problem with all this, the thing that really got him in trouble, like I said, is that this drove a lot of people nuts. You see, in the process of asking these questions, Socrates would generally show that people were almost always confused or mistaken or just flat out wrong about what all these different things were. He showed that people didn't really know what they thought they knew. Because as you get from the dialogues a little bit, Socrates would ask a lot of questions, and somebody would answer, and then he would keep asking questions, like asking about implications of things, or, if you say X, doesn't that mean Y? Or, so you choose X, alright, so would you then say, Y or Z? Okay, so if X and then Y, then therefore A must be the case, right? Oh no, you don't agree with A. Well, all these things are connected, so that must mean you didn't really mean X. And, things like that. He would end up driving people nuts because he showed that they were really confused and mistaken about things. They didn't really understand all of the things they thought they understood. And I gotta say, if you essentially walk around proving people wrong about everything, you're not a very popular human being. Just, key for success right there. But the reason why Socrates did all this sort of thing, as he explains in the Apology, is because he believed that essentially God had told him to. You see, supposedly he once visited the oracle of the god Apollo at Delphi. And the oracle is supposed to be like the voice of the god Apollo on Earth. And so what the oracle says is the message intended to be said directly by Apollo. And the oracle at Delphi once told Socrates that he was the wisest man in all of Greece. And this confused the ever-loving hell out of Socrates. Because Socrates knows he's not a tradesman. Like, he grew up in Athens, he served in the Peloponnesian War, and after that, he's been pretty much close to homeless. He hangs out with his friends, and they give him some money, and he's got a wife and kid, but he doesn't see him a whole lot. So, basically, the dude's a deadbeat, and he knows it. He knows that he has no skills, no training. He doesn't know much of anything about anything. He's smart. He just has, really no education or training whatsoever. So he really doesn't know how in the world he can be the wisest man in all of Greece. So, being Socrates, he walks in and starts asking people about it. He starts trying to figure out how in the world could this be true, because the oracle is supposed to never lie. The oracle's word is supposed to be absolutely true. So how is it that he could be the wisest man in Greece while knowing nothing? Well, it turns out that he discovers that people are very often confused and mistaken. You see, while people are usually experts at a couple of things, they think that they're experts at everything. So, he's meeting carpenters who thought they knew stuff about poetry and art and all these other stuff, or how best to live, or how to raise good sons, or something like that. And they really didn't know any of that stuff besides carpentry. I'm sure you guys know the type of person we're talking about here. Somebody who's got just a little bit of experience with one thing, and they think that they know it all about everything. So, somebody who learned a little bit of something, and then they act like an expert on everything anytime something comes up, those are the kinds of people that Socrates is meeting. And those are the kinds of people that Socrates is talking with. And so he slowly realizes that he's the only one who knows that he doesn't actually know all that much. He's the only one who actually can admit to himself that he knows very little. He once is known for saying, "I'm the wisest man in all of Greece because I alone know that I know nothing." He's the only person who realizes that he doesn't actually know anything, and that he is legitimately trying to find the answers to this stuff. So he started to take it as his mission to either find people who actually did know things and learn from them, or to help show people that they had things to learn as well, that they really didn't know some stuff. So it's his mission now to either learn from people or show that they're idiots. And that's what he took away from his trip to the Oracle anyway. So, to use his metaphor for it, Socrates took it as his mission to be like a gadfly that stings a horse. Flies sting horses, they move a bit quicker, they jerk to get rid of the fly or something. The gadfly stirs the still animal into motion. So Socrates took it as his mission to show others what they didn't understand so that they could pursue the actual truth, so that they could learn it too. This was in effect, in his words, urging people to care for their souls and avoid the kinds of harms that Plato later endorses and talks about in the Republic. Letting reason wither and letting the human part of you die off a little bit. Socrates is trying to drive people to avoid that kind of harm. He's really well known, perhaps better known even than the I know nothing line, for a quote from the Apology, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Socrates thought that only an examined life, only a life that actively seeks truth and questions everything it encounters, only that kind of life is worthy of a human being. It's the only worthwhile life for a person to live. And in the end, they killed him for it. So just be aware, even if you are a genius and a brilliant human being who makes the world a better place by inspiring Western scholarship and science and everything else, if you're a jerk, they will kill you for it. There is actual historical precedent for it. So, be aware. Key to success, life pro tip, whatever you want to call it. Now, the reason why I talk about all this is two things. See, not quite two things. For one, the reason I bring all this up now is at this point in the class, you've actually done a little bit of philosophy. You actually have had a small taste of what an examined life is like. That is, in a way, you guys are alumni of Plato's Cave. You have gone out of the darkness and into the light, if only a little bit. Because over the course of this class, I've forced you to ask questions about things you probably never wondered about. So, I want you to do two different things. First, I want to have you consider a brief question. Has this small taste of the examined life benefited you in some way? And I mean, like, besides just getting credit for the class. You know, you're technically right, but being a bit of a smartass if that was your instinctive response. You know, I think that too. That's why I mentioned it. But just be aware. A little bit of the wrong direction there. So sure, you're getting credit for the class if you did, halfway decent and got I think a C is the threshold for that. But has the class, or more directly, has asking these types of questions helped you or inspired you in some other, more personal way? We've studied a lot of different questions and fields. Things ranging from morality to knowledge to whether you're a physical or a non-physical thing. Stuff you probably have never wondered about before. And that means that you've had to consider and examine several things that you probably already had beliefs about. You might not have ever been explicit about it. You might not have ever said, I believe I'm a solely physical thing. Maybe some of you have, but probably most of you haven't. And so over the course of this class, even if you just kind of faked it for the journals or the exams or something, you've at least had to follow along with and follow the path of questioning that covers a lot of these topics. You've had to examine things that you never did before, or that you already had beliefs about, and maybe had to revise some of those beliefs. Regardless of what they are, you had to look into things. So, you've lived a little bit of the examined life, and I want you to see, or question, has it benefited you? Can you see some worth doing this? And the second thing I want you to do, or that I want to do for you, is to point out a challenge. You see, in both the Allegory of the Cave and in the Apology, Plato and Socrates sort of argue for there being almost a duty to go out and help others to search for truth and to examine things. In the Allegory of the Cave, the guy who leaves doesn't just run off and live his own life, and he doesn't just go back into the cave and exploit all the poor suckers by making really good puppets. I mean, he could. He's the only one who actually knows what a horse looks like, so he could take over the cave and show them the best damn entertainment they've ever seen. He could be a total con man about the whole thing. Make whatever amounts to cave money hand over fist. But he doesn't. In the Allegory of the Cave, he helps his fellow prisoners out and realizes that the only way they will come to know and experience the beauty and wonder that he has is by having them see it themselves. They've got to figure these things out for themselves. They have to see the truth for themselves. You can't force it on them. You can't give them, the truth as you understood it. But you can show them how to get there. Socrates also saw it as his mission to help encourage others to question and examine things, to have them not just accept the lessons of their own society or the half-baked lessons they learned in their own life. Instead, he encouraged them to actively seek out and reason and think their way through problems and things that they just took for granted. And while I'm not encouraging you to become, a wandering homeless philosopher or anything like that, or to abandon your major and just pursue this, although if you really like philosophy and you find this stuff fascinating, there's always more room around the fire for you guys. But instead, I want to challenge you to, at the very least, not stop examining and questioning things. You've been doing it for about, several weeks at this point. And even if it wasn't quite your thing, even if this isn't going to be your lifelong burning passion or, your favorite way to spend a Friday night, I want you to keep questioning things and finding your own answers for things. Don't just take everything you hear for granted. Continue to search for fundamental truths and principles and ideas. Even if you already believe very important things in your life, that's wonderful. But I want you to earn that belief. I want you to question it and have reasons for those beliefs. I want you to continue to examine things and to continue try and live an examined life. If you do, I almost guarantee you will find it worthwhile and you will succeed as a student, as a professional, and just as a human being. Yeah, I think it'll be good for you guys. And so I want to challenge you to not give this sort of stuff up. If you see any worth in it at all, I highly encourage you to pursue it in some way, even if it's just approaching your own favorite subject matter, your own career, in a slightly different way. And so, I want to leave you with two different things, in addition to this question and this challenge. First, I want to tell you guys that I am quite honestly very proud of you all. I mean, I know that this has not the best format for a philosophy class, the online, the reading, the lectures. I know it's difficult when you don't have the face-to-face interaction, or the same type of regular schedule that a in-person class has, where you go to class at 8:30 and you leave by 9:30 and you do the homework that night. I know this has been a little bit challenging, and I know that the work has probably been unconventional. For some of you, it's very much not to your taste. So I want to say I'm very proud of you guys for putting in the effort, for making your way through this, and for sticking with it. I'm quite honestly very happy with the work you guys have done. So I'm proud of you, honestly. And second, I want to leave you with something else. If you only take away two things from this class, I want you to take away the idea that you should question and examine everything. Never stop looking for truth. And two, I want to leave you with this last quote from Socrates. Wonder is the feeling of a philosopher, and philosophy begins in wonder. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. It's the search of fundamental truth, or a search for fundamental truth. It is a life and an attitude and a field of study that tries to get at the heart of things. But always at its own heart, there's a sense of wonder, of amazement, and curiosity that I want you guys to never let go of. If you've ever experienced it at all, keep it. If not, keep searching for it. I promise it's there. So, go forth, keep your sense of wonder, and happy thinking, guys. Thanks.